Hello, and welcome back to a Friends of Cabrini Read Aloud featuring A Time to Act, John F. Kennedy's Big Speech, authored by Shana Corey, illustrated by R. Gregory Christie. We hope you enjoy this read aloud. A Time to Act. John F. Kennedy loved to read about history, but history isn't just in books. It's happening all around us. And the people who make history aren't just famous leaders or characters in stories. They're real people, just like you. Sometimes they are you. John, or Jack as he was called, was the second of 9 children in a big, rich family. If you saw the Kennedys, you might think they had everything. But take a closer look. Jack wasn't the favorite. That was his big brother Joe. Their father wanted Joe to grow up to be president. No one was sure what Jack would be. Jack didn't always do well in school. He is casual and disorderly and can seldom locate his possessions, noted one school report. And he was often sick. But Jack was funny and people liked him. When Jack was too sick to play outdoors, he read. Jack also liked to write. As a boy, he once wrote a letter to his father asking for a raise in his allowance. When he got older, he thought about being a journalist and sometimes carried a notebook around to jot down his ideas. In college, he put some of those ideas into a paper. His father helped him publish it as a book. Why England Slept became a bestseller. Jack's mother taught her children the importance of giving back to one's country. Jack took that belief seriously. When the United States entered World War II, he joined the fight. On August 2nd, 1943, an enemy ship ripped into the boat he commanded. Jack led the survivors to safety, towing one of the injured for more than 3 miles by holding the man's life belt in his teeth. The Navy wrote to Jack's parents, praising his courage. Kennedy's son is hero, declared the New York Times. But in the water, Jack hadn't had a lot of choices. It was involuntary, he said. They sunk my boat. Jack's brother Joe also served his country, but Joe wasn't as lucky as Jack. A year after Jack's rescue, Joe was killed flying over the English Channel. The family was heartbroken. Now it was up to Jack to carry out his father's dreams for Joe. In 1946, Jack ran for Congress. His whole family helped. His father gave money and advice. His mother and sisters gave teas. Jack wasn't a natural at public speaking at first, but he worked hard. He knocked on doors, he shook hands, and he won people over with his charm. On November 5th, 1946, 29-year-old Jack won the election. After 6 years as a congressman, Jack was elected to the Senate. Americans loved the handsome young senator. He and his new wife, Jackie, were celebrities. Soon after they were married, Jack had back surgery. While he recovered, he wrote another book, with the help of his staff. Profiles in Courage, told about people who had the courage to take a stand for things they believed in, even when they weren't popular stands. To be courageous requires no exceptional qualifications, Jack wrote. It is an opportunity that sooner or later is presented to all of us. Each man must decide for himself the course he will follow. Which course would Jack choose? On January 2nd, 1960, Jack announced that he was running for president of the United States. Years of practice had turned him into a powerful speaker, but not everyone thought he could win. He was 42 years old, younger than any president who had been elected before. President Dwight D. Eisenhower called him that young whippersnapper. Eleanor Roosevelt thought Jack's father was spending too much money to help him get elected. My dear boy, she telegrammed, I only say these things for your own good. And Jack was Catholic. Many believed the country wouldn't elect a Catholic. I believe in an America where religious intolerance will someday end, said Jack. America was also in the midst of a long, hard struggle over civil rights. Civil rights are rights for all people to be treated fairly without being discriminated against. In many places, Black people were not treated fairly. In the South especially, a system called segregation kept Black people apart from white people. Even though the Supreme Court had declared it illegal, Black people were not allowed to go to the same schools as white people. They were not allowed to drink from the same water fountains, or eat in the same restaurants, or stay in the same hotels. Black people couldn't always get the same jobs as white people, and sometimes they were kept from voting. Many Americans, both civil rights leaders, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and others who weren't famous, even students and children, were trying to change that through peaceful protests. In the decade that lies ahead, the American presidency will demand that the president place himself in the very thick of the fight. It is not enough merely to represent prevailing sentiment. We must act in the image of Abraham Lincoln, said Jack. Just 1 month after Jack announced he was running for president, 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, began a sit-in. They sat quietly and peacefully at a all-whites-only lunch counter and waited to be served. They were refused. Every day, more and more students joined them. By the end of the week, the sit-ins had spread across the South. Some white people yelled at the protesters. Some spit at them or threw food. But some joined them. And no matter what was yelled or thrown at them, the protesters sat quietly and peacefully, waiting to be served, working for change. The aim of the next president of the United States must be to achieve equal opportunity for all Americans regardless of race, said Jack. This requires equal access in the voting booth, to the schoolroom, and to lunch counters. That October, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and sent to prison after participating in a sit-in. His wife, Coretta Scott King, feared he would be killed. Jack's campaign worked secretly with Georgia's governor to get Dr. King released. Some of Jack's advisors worried this would cost him the votes of white people who didn't support civil rights. But Jack telephoned Mrs. King. "If there is anything I can do to help, please feel free to call on me," he said. On November 8, 1960, Jack was elected the 35th President of the United States. He won by the slimmest of margins, but many black people had voted for him. Jack wanted his inauguration speech to inspire hope. He looked to history and asked his speechwriter to study Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Jack wrote and rewrote. He practiced at breakfast and even in the bathtub. On the morning of January 20th, 1961, 20,000 people thronged the streets of Washington. Marian Anderson sang the Star-Spangled Banner. Robert Frost read a poem. And finally, Jack began to speak. "Let the word go forth that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." In some things, the new president acted quickly and used bold words. He established the Peace Corps and challenged young Americans to go out into the world and work shoulder to shoulder with people in other countries. The volunteers built roads and bridges, libraries, and schools. The United States and the Soviet Union were rivals competing to be the strongest. The Soviet Union had already sent a man into space. Jack declared that the United States would be the first to land a man on the moon. Less than a year later, Americans everywhere turned on their televisions and watched astronaut John Glenn lift off into space. The space race was on. Jack worked to keep relations with the Soviet Union peaceful, and he traveled the world. In Berlin, 2 million people cheered when he stood at the wall that separated free West Berlin from Soviet-held East Berlin. "Freedom is indivisible," Jack said. "When one man is enslaved, all are not free." But on important civil rights issues, Jack was slow to act. He had once declared that the president must be willing to get in the thick of the fight, but now he seemed unwilling to fight some battles. "I would like to be patient," the famous baseball player Jackie Robinson wrote to Jack. "But patience has cost us years in our struggle for human dignity." While Jack hesitated, others stepped forward and acted. In 1961, young black and white people, called Freedom Riders, tried to integrate buses in the South. Angry crowds smashed their windows. They slashed the tires. They set fire to the buses. But the young people didn't give up. That October, Dr. Martin Luther King met with Jack at the White House. When he passed a framed copy of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the document that had freed slaves, Dr. King suggested Jack write a second Emancipation Proclamation to outlaw segregation. But Jack worried about losing the support of those in Congress who disagreed. So Jack didn't write a new proclamation. He didn't take bold action. But others were taking action. "Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever," Dr. King wrote from a Birmingham jail in April 1963. In that May, despite the danger, hundreds of black children and teenagers once again stood up and acted. They left their classrooms in Birmingham, Alabama, and, singing songs of freedom, marched peacefully to protest segregation. They were hauled off to jail. But the next day, even more young people arrived to take their places. The police blasted them off their feet with water hoses. They turned vicious dogs on them. Americans, including Jack, saw the young people's courage on the news and were sickened by the violence. Stay tuned for part 2 of this read aloud.